So I think we'll get started. Kaya, and welcome to our second Environment Matters for the year of 2022. Thank you for joining us here tonight. It's wonderful to have you all here and to be joining us for a very special session on the important topic of nature conservation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Greenwell and I'm the Citizen Science Manager at the Conservation Council of Western Australia. And tonight I'm delighted to be your MC. It's a privilege to be working here on Whadjuk Noongar country and to be meeting here this evening. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge the enduring culture and connection of First Nations people to the land and waters of this beautiful country here in Western Australia. As the first custodians of this land, I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, and we are fortunate to be able to be sustained on the country they have cared for since immemorial. The Environment Matters series is one of CCWA's longest running forums. We bring together experts and stakeholders from industry, government, as well as the community to discuss environmental issues in a forum where you, the community, can actually participate and contribute to the conversation. Last year, the Conservation Council of WA released their 2030 vision, and it's a movement story for conservation, climate and community. This is our core communication platform designed to position CCWA within a hopeful climate and conservation narrative. We aim to use storytelling to shift the conversation around the environment and climate away from the paralysing politics and divisions towards a more hopeful vision that unites and inspires communities and leaders. Events like this are a key aspect of this. Tonight you will be given an overview of the current state of conservation here in Western Australia and hear from our great lineup of guests on the all-important topic of where to from here. In the face of significant challenges, this will be a hopeful dialogue centred on solutions and a vision for the future. So unfortunately, Carmen has been delayed this evening, but as we get started, I'll hand over to Dr. Nick Dunlop and then on to Dr. Mike Bamford and Mike Calver, who are all experts in their field. We will then conclude with a panel Q&A session where you can get a chance to ask presenters some questions that you may have. So if you have questions that pop up during this evening, please write them down and we'll get to those at the end of the session. While all this is happening, you will notice here we have Peter Roebuck from Tuna Blue Facilitation, and she'll be scribbling away and turning these discussions into a fabulous and easy to understand series of images. Our speakers will be around for an informal chat until around 8:15 and we'll be serving tea and coffee up the back. So just a little housekeeping before we begin. Firstly, if you need the bathroom, it's just out these doors and down the corridor on the left. If there's an emergency, we'll ask you to head in a safe manner out the door and assemble on the grass in the park across the road. And I'll just ask you to take a moment now to check that your mobile phones are on silent. Thank you. So now for our first presentation, we have Dr. Nick Dunlop, who will be speaking about the emerging approaches to nature conservation. Many of you will know Nick. He's been leading the citizen science program for the past decade, and he spent many, many years working with the community, all levels of government, scientists, First Nations people, and thousands of volunteers to ensure that science informs conservation management outcomes. His passion for our sector is truly remarkable, and anyone who has been out in the field with Nick will know this. So welcome, Nick. So you can use that order.
Yep.
Thank you.
it's a bit unfortunate Carmen's not here to give you the broader context for this, but my task, in a miraculous 20 minutes, is to tell you where we've been, where we are, and what we might be doing in the future when it comes to nature conservation. I'll talk mostly about the legislation around wildlife and conservation by reserves. Mike of the Bamford variety will talk about the environmental protection legislation and how that works in relation to biodiversity. And MC squared we'll talk about the role of scientists in conservation and informing policy. Our first conservation laws date back actually to about the 1950s or slightly earlier with the Wildlife Conservation Act. This is an act which was about hunting, shooting and fishing. It was about managing the harvest of wildlife or wildflowers and things like duck shooting and those sorts of things, and the regulation of scientific investigations. But it wasn't about protecting habitat, or in those days, not even about species conservation beyond basic common law requirements. Legal section is such that wildlife are protected unless you're told they're not, and fisheries are unprotected unless they tell you are. So there's a fundamental difference in the way that those pieces of legislation work. We were looking at a new Wildlife Conservation Act, a modern one. We started looking at that process way back when Carmen was Premier, 1992. I can remember writing a submission on that. We finally got a new act in 2016, but it wasn't what we were looking for, which is not that surprising given who the government was at the time. But the new Act, the Biodiversity Conservation Act 2016, does have some provisions for habitat protection. It's outside the reserve system. Lots of provisions for procedures to list things or unlist things. And from that, recovery plans for threatened species, and other sorts of management plans, biodiversity management plans. Basically a lot of plans, but no real commitment towards government actually achieving anything in particular with respect to biodiversity conservation. The Act has a new definition of disturbance, which comes out of the original definition of take. That has been a diabolical cause of all sorts of issues, particularly with community groups, about relatively benign activities requiring licences, and that has also now been doubled up with requirements to drag all the stuff into the Animal Welfare Act. There's regulation for translocations, which is one of the major things that BBCA does these days, and there's a Section 40 provision, which I'll talk about in a minute, which requires anyone operating in an area where there's a threatened species to have a ministerial approval, in our case on top of our other approvals for things like the ferry term work. The Act 216 has hardly been implemented in terms of administrative things that need to happen around that, yet we are now at a point where it's actually up for review. So we're reviewing it before it actually got progressed in any serious way. Of course, we're avoiding reviewing it at the moment, but the provision is actually there in the legislation. After a 5-year period, it's supposed to be reviewed. So that's an opportunity for us to start to see if we can get some major changes to the way that legislation works or doesn't work. The other thing is the addition of attractions to the scope of DBCA is effectively producing a conflict of interest with tourism, much as we had a conflict of interest with forestry in the past. And you can actually see that working its way out through things like the Abrolhos Islands National Park plan. Now, Section 40 sort of underpins the modus operandi of conservation at the moment. Section 40, as I mentioned, requires anyone operating in an area with a threatened species to get ministerial approval to carry out their activities. And Mike, no doubt, will have been helping with that. That ministerial approval will come with conditions. The minister's conditions and the apparent purpose for this section is so the department can milk offsets from developers to fund the conservation program. If anyone's looked at the clearing policy, you can see that fully in operation there. The government claims that they can achieve net gain for biodiversity, but the thing we always have to remember that if there's an offset, a critical environmental asset has been damaged or destroyed. So it's a very difficult area where conservation has to be effectively funded by destruction. And that's the space that we're tending to work in at the moment. And we need to be very careful to what extent we embrace this strategy to get conservation action done. And I mentioned the recent land clearing policy is similarly pointing at offsets to fund it, as well as so-called carbon farming. Conservation through reserves started a bit later. The initial work was done by the Australian Academy of Science chapter in Western Australia in 1965. It's just a little bit before my time, but not much. And then we had a Conservation through Reserves Committee in many of you remember all the systems where they were trying to cobble together a representative reserve system using what were bioregions we had before we had bioregions. And so many of you remember that some regions have got reasonably high level of representation, and others, like for example, System 6, the Swan Coastal Plain, a very poor level of representation in the reserve system. None of them were completely finished, and of course all of them were based on finding what was left behind and trying to get that into the reserve system. It's very difficult to get a representative reserve system when you're just dealing with remnants that have escaped by accidents. In fact, in a lot of areas that I've looked, there's been more bush saved by bureaucratic inactivity than by bureaucratic action. Often, most of what we got left with were just plain lucky, and that's about it. We have a Conservation Commission and the CALM Act in 1984. I go back to fisheries and wildlife days. In my view, the on-ground services of fisheries and wildlife are far superior than anything we've got today. So the management of reserve lands of all kinds of came into the Reserve of CALM Act. It also provided provisions for the creation of marine reserves, although that's something that happened later. And we had a Conservation Commission, which was supposed to be a body corporate to represent our interest in the conservation estate as the owners of the land. We had the Wilson report in '94 when we started to move towards a representative system of marine reserves. And we had a Marine Parks and Reserves Authority, which is now fused to become the WA Conservation Parks Commission. And again, a set of proposals that Wilson put forward about representative marine reserves. Quite a few have been created. the rub with marine reserves is an outer boundary, but when you look at what's going on inside, it's frequently not very different to what's going on outside. So the value of these measures for conservation is hotly disputed and debatable. I was recently looking at some of the old management plans for marine parks, and very few of the ones I looked at had actually implemented the things that those parks were set up to implement. So do we want to drop the ball on that, or do we want to go back and bring that all back to the front? We also, of course, more recently had a Commonwealth Marine Reserves process. Much the same thing happened, of course. The outer boundaries of the Commonwealth Marine Reserves were largely determined by the offshore oil and gas industry, and the internal zoning largely determined by the commercial fishing industry. In fact, the commercial fishing industry is actually regarded as the main management agency for Commonwealth Marine Reserves in terms of doing anything on the water. We had a poor result initially, and then when Abbott got in, we got a worse result. We suspended the existing plans, and the latest plan does very little for conservation except in a few areas. All needs to be revisited. When you recall, we had a Save Our Marine Life campaign that went on for quite a while. The outcome, unfortunately, wasn't, from a conservation point of view, particularly useful. Section 40, remember you said it applies to anyone conducting operations in an area with a threatened species. And DBCA obviously applies it, particularly with resource companies and people, probably because they come with deep pockets for offset plans. But when it happens and it coincides with the operations of the fishery, they've chosen not to apply it. So here we have the bycatch of the flesh-footed shearwaters, now a threatened species down in King George Sound. We did approach them and said, well, you can apply section 40 here, but they didn't deny that. We had legal advice to support it, but just chose that it wasn't going to involve them in a conflict with another agency. So there are several impediments now to expanding the reserve system. And this, of course, has been very much the core business of the conservation sector for many years, creating new and bigger reserves, terrestrial reserves here. Obviously, the opportunity has been lost in some places because the representative communities no longer exist. On Coastal Plain, there's a number of those. There's also little viable bushland for, Crown land in places like the Wheatbelt, that if we're going to make any inroads in this, we're going to be looking for bush that's on private land. The mining industry in the pastoral zone has been impeding the creation of true reserves out in the rangelands. The problem here is that if any of that land goes back to Crown land in the process of becoming a reserve, it becomes open to native title claim, and then the mining industry has to negotiate with the traditional owners. So they basically put pressure on the government not to allow that situation to occur. And quite a few of our purchases of rangeland for conservation are fairly latent at the moment, waiting for some sort of resolution. Particularly affects things like trying to conserve banded iron ranges and things which have quite unique biodiversity attributes. There are also very few resources available to manage nature reserves. Sometimes we have to ring the department to get permission to enter one, and the officer has to go off and look it up. We didn't know what it was. And that's probably a fair measure of how much attention a lot of nature reserves get. All the resources, of course, tend to direct towards attractions in national parks, which of course are related to managing people in relation to the tourism sector. So what have we got that's actually coming up that it might be useful for telling those positive stories and to doing things in a different way? One is that there have been enormous advances in ecological restoration technology in the last decade, and a lot more players in that game, on which that, of course, needs to be combined with the protection of remnant vegetation and blocking up the landscape to make it possible to have larger populations of plants and animals around our island reserves or our bushland patches. There's been the emergence of the non-government land management conservation groups like AWC and Bush Heritage, and U1, Bush Guardians, and smaller private landowners as well who are doing this. Some of them are our member groups. And there's also globally a rewilding agenda starting to emerge. I can't fully embrace the rewilding agenda because it means setting our baseline at the time that human beings removed the megafauna, which is a leap too far for me. And I can't actually magic up a diprotodon for some of the ecosystems that I'm managing. Whereas in the Northern Hemisphere grasslands, you can bring back bison or elephants as a surrogate for mammoths or something. But in Australia, at that level, there's not much of an application. But there are some interesting things about that. And one is, for example, if you really wanted to conserve rangelands, or if you wanted to lock up carbon in them, the single cheapest and most successful way of doing that is just to leave the dingoes alone. That is a functional solution to multi-species overgrazing scenarios. And they're very effective at it in places where I've observed the dogs getting out of hand. So they have actually a role in conservation rather than being something which in the rangelands at least actually persecuting. Rewilding has a new tendency towards the emphasis being on restoring function, which is rather than the process we had in the past, which is all about just-in-time conservation of species when they become threatened. The theory being, if we can get ecosystems functioning properly, we should end up with a lot less threatened species than we have to deal with. And we'll need an increase in the practice of adaptive management because of climate change. And practitioners really have a few options when we're talking about climate change. One is to try and resist that change, try and protect all the species in an ecosystem that you're working on. Another one is to accept change and let the ecosystem evolve naturally without intervening, which may mean allowing species to disappear or be replaced by others. And then there's the other more radical one of facilitating change, second guessing where the climate's going and actually moving organisms around to create new, sometimes novel ecosystems. A model that's worked well for us is the Fairy Turn Network, which is run through the Cons Council. And it sort of also highlights another point that I made, and that is that we have a fixation on describing threatened species, listing them when we should in fact just be getting on with it. And the basic unit of conservation is the interbreeding population, not species that are threatened. We recently had an issue with DVCA about penguin population on Penguin Island. When we said it's disappearing, what are we going to do? They said, well, nothing, it's not listed. So we need to get away from that. Our network covers and engages all these people, including the government agencies, who are willing to participate in many parts of the state. It's a bottom-up process that involves people. It's not directed by something. We've just got a recovery plan for this species, but we're so far ahead of the game we don't actually need it. So one approach I think worth taking, and we're looking at the clearing regs the other day, is we probably need what they have in some other jurisdictions, which is the Nature Guarantee Act, which basically says we get ahead of things and we make sure we provide functionally for things to have what they need, and then we can worry about footprints for development once we understand, once we have adequately protected. we could protect 30% of the remaining vegetation in parts of the southwest as a matter of course, as a matter of policy, and that will make it much easier to understand the consequences of the other things that we're doing in the environment. That will probably mean enacting planning legislation to allow that to happen. There's already a lot of pushback in rural areas against restoration and carbon farming, and we're going to need some sort of planning mechanism to get around that issue. Another example of making provision is animals that need very special requirements. This is a ghost bat from the Pilbara. Yeah, I get it. Which has maternity sites in deep caves. These are progressively being mined out by the iron ore industry, with approvals going, one at a time. So it doesn't matter about this one, does it? No, it doesn't matter about this one or this one. We just keep doing it. Some years ago, we did an investigation and also found that a lot of the ghost bats in the Pilbara have actually moved into old underground mines, which are actually very good habitat for them. But the only problem is that as soon as the gold price went up, they all got opened up. So we don't have that again. But if anyone can make new caves, it's the mining industry. And though the Talassiders say that we're the cave people, we're the cave exploding people, and this cave is long gone. And that's me at the ripe old age of 22. So, all right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick, for that very insightful summary of legislation and where we're going. We have time for one question. Does anybody have a quick question? Otherwise, we'll cut to Mike and we can take questions at the end. Yes, sir.
Can you compare the future legislative changes? Do you hold more faith in state or federal legislation?
Oh, I see. Neither.
Can you repeat? What was the question, Nick?
The last government was actually doing exactly what our government is doing. It's trying to create an offsets bank.
Sorry, Nick. Just for the recording, you want me to speak?
Yeah.
And just repeat.
Yeah.
Thanks.
The last government was doing something similar to our state government, and its two priorities were hand over responsibility to the states for decision making and to set up an offsets bank to fund future conservation. I don't know what we're going to get with the current one, but the EPBC Act has never been a particularly effective piece of legislation in Western Australia. And under the Constitution, the states have so much more responsibility for land management. That's really where we need to be looking.
Thanks, Nick. So next we'll hear from Dr. Mike Bamford, who will be talking about nature conservation in relation to environmental impact assessment. Mike is a freelance wildlife biologist, author, illustrator, science communicator. He has a particular interest in field techniques for wildlife research and how wildfire survives in changing environments. He has carried out research on the impacts of fire on fauna, the colonisation of mine site rehabilitation by fauna, and fauna in urban landscapes. It's a great privilege to have you here tonight, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Nick, for that introduction for me. I don't need to talk much about legislation now. I can get to what I really want to talk about. That's all right. The freelance zoologist is a nice way of saying I'm an environmental consultant. That means I'm the guy who does reports that get assessed by the EPA when mining companies want to get approval for a project. That's not all I do, but some of what I do is that. And it's not always an easy place to be in, but I've been doing it for 40 odd years. And I've learned a bit over that time. So Nick's given me 15 minutes to tell you what I've learned. So that's a before and after photograph. Nick's ghost bat cave's probably in there somewhere. Oops. Which one?
Hang on, I'll just click on the screen.
Oh, I could just tick on there as well.
No, and now if you do, it should work.
There we go. Okay. Environmental impact assessment. So I'm going straight into the process rather than talking about the legislation. It is governed by legislation. There's their names there. So what? And the photographs show a real before and after. The left-hand photograph is the Carrara Hills inland from Perenjori, and the right-hand photograph is the wheat belt near Perenjori. I like to remind people about the wheat belt because if you want to look at an environmental disaster, that's the wheat belt. Will the mining company industry, not defending them, but they're never going to destroy as much landscape as the agricultural industry has destroyed. I grew up with 1 million acres a year being boasted about on TV. I'm still angry about it. Oops. I'm having trouble here. Oh, yeah. The Environmental Protection Authority are the guys that I prepare reports for, and they have a key objective with respect to development and fauna. I just do fauna. I'm not talking about plants today. And I think their objective is fantastic. Protect terrestrial fauna. You can all read, I'll read it anyway. Protect terrestrial fauna so that biological diversity and ecological integrity are maintained. That's good. That's good. Say yes, it's good. But that's what they're doing, or they're trying to do. But of course, we're all part of the problem. And I think it's worth remembering that we're part of the problem. I love that land sale sign with the wildflower ridge. And we all know what happens next to wildflowers. To help the EPA meet that objective, or to try to meet that objective, there's an industry of environmental consultants has arisen. I'm part of that industry. And they're supposed to provide information to help the EPA make decisions. That's a conservative estimate of what that industry is worth. That's just pre-approval investigations. It's not the offsets Nick was talking about. It's not the conditions. It's not rehabilitation costs. It's just the cost of guys like me going out and doing surveys to give a report to the EPA so the mining company or a land developer or a farmer wanting to clear a patch of bush or whatever can get approval to do what they want to do. And that's a honey possum and some turtle frogs. So what do consultants do with all that money? I drive a 25-year-old four-wheel drive, so I'm not getting much of it. But I'm very fond of it. And this is where it gets interesting. We've got the guidance, we've got the legislation, we've got the objective. Then we have guidance that the EPA produces, and that's supposed to guide consultants to go out there and collect information to help these guys make decisions. And you get to go on some great field trips. You get to fly around in helicopters and camp out in the bush. But what I find increasingly frustrating is that the guidance statements zero in on surveys. As Nick said, not quite the same context, on producing lists. There's an assumption that to assess the risk of a project to biodiversity, you actually need to know what's there. That might make some sort of sense, but the outcome of that thinking is somewhat strange. There are two basic sorts of surveys that consultants do. There are targeted surveys where you go after significant species. In some cases, you get 2 to the price of 1, a rock wallaby and a northern quoll, who's both trying to get the same bait tube. That sort of makes sense. Then there are inventory surveys, and inventory surveys are a hot topic of debate among consultants and the EPA constantly. Inventory surveys almost always target frogs, reptiles, birds, mammals, the vertebrates, and a few invertebrates, but not very many. That means that inventory surveys are targeting less than 5% of the fauna assemblage. All those thousands of invertebrates get ignored. And it's actually the invertebrates that in many cases are the sort of keystone species in many ecosystems. The targeted surveys make sense. You do need to know what significant species are present. If you have got ghost bats in a cave, you need to know where they are. And if you're a mining company, you need to make some effort to avoid them. And to be fair to some mining companies, they actually try a lot harder these days than they did once. But the inventory surveys are perplexing. What do you need? Why do you need to know what frogs, reptiles, birds, and mammals are in an area if your key objective is about ecosystem function? Those two photographs, Great Sandy Desert on the left, Jarrah Forest on the right. Any consultant worth his salt can produce a species list from those areas without going there. Most of consultants have done a lot of work over the years, and they know their country pretty well. Worst case, inventory surveys just produce a list or just tick off a list. You get a list from databases, go out there, oh, I've got one of those, tick, another one of those, tick, and that's what an inventory survey does. But look at the cost of an inventory survey. And if you've got a helicopter, another $10,000 a day. A friend of mine recently did his trap round for 10 days in a row by helicopter because it was so remote. And he came back and said, I got all the usual species, $100,000 later. And they're not complete. And that's what's really frightening. I'm lucky enough to have done a few long-term projects. Nick will remember Cooljaloo. I'm still going there. 1986, Nick. Yeah. It took us in our current monitoring for the last 30 years, almost all 30 years, to get to the point where they can be found all frog, reptile, mammal, and small mammal and bird species in that area. 30 years, 24 and 26 to be precise. In fact, the birds took a bit longer. The two main sampling sites are only half a kilometre apart, and they haven't even got the same fauna assemblage. And the EPA is saying, you've got to give us an inventory. Well, quick little bit of graph. The brown dots are how many species each of those transects recorded in a year's sampling. The green line with dots is the accumulation of species in the long term. Each year we get 10, 15, 20 species of frog, reptile, small mammal on those transects, never more. So we're getting less than half in any one year. And it wasn't until 24, 25, 26 years that we stopped adding species. There's a lot going on in that graph with that much data. We've actually got to the point now where we're seeing species turnover. Some species are coming in, some species are leaving from the site. And yet, for the EPA to make a decision, they want people like consultants to go out and spend vast amounts of money to do a species list in 1 year. And by the way, 49, 47 species, there's one species of conservation significance at that site. It's a small snake. All those are common species which are on my list already. I didn't actually need to go there and catch them. What we're doing with monitoring is quite different. We're looking at the use of rehabilitation areas and the impact of fire, which is research, not ticking off lists. So the obvious question, could they do better? I think in my business, the industry I'm in, we need to take a step back and ask, when development happens or when it's proposed, what are the consequences? What is the risk? In fact, a step further back, as we're scientists, what is the question? I've gone to the EPA and said, what do you want me to find out? And they say, oh, I'll go and do a survey and catch lots of species. Yeah. We know there's loss of individuals if land gets cleared. Estimates of density of some reptiles are massive. But what's the impact on biodiversity? What actually happens when a Pilbara iron ore mine goes off, for example? In a nutshell, impacts on biodiversity are functions of things like context. Is it a small patch of bush surrounded by farmland? Is it a big, undisturbed tract of bushland where a small mine is going to make no difference? Are there significant species threat present? And what threatening processes might be triggered? That's really what it comes down to. There are threatening processes, and mines or development of some sort interact with those processes to affect biodiversity. That's where the investigations should be going. That's a photograph of the wheat belt. I brought wheat belt up again, couldn't resist it. Surveys in little bits of bush like that, which might be proposed for development, will be quite different from surveys in an intact, continuous landscape. That's what I mean by context. Although, to be honest, in the wheat belt, you don't need to bother to do a survey. Just leave it alone. Better still, protect it. So, I've managed to get down to the topic for tonight. Next step. Really importantly, I think, I deal with the approvals process a lot of the time with a bit of monitoring. And I think approval should not be the end of environmental impact assessment, the way it's often seen. There are offsets, as Nick said, but offsets are a drop in the ocean compared with what's being spent. And very few projects actually get committed to offsets. So they've really got to be doing something pretty nasty to be hit with big offsets. So at the end of approval, or once things are approved, that's when the conservation action should begin. There's huge scope for post-approval monitoring. I'm doing that with a few projects like the Tronox stuff, which is mineral sands. But there's a potential for a network of monitoring sites across the state with every major development project. And there's a new database which the government's really thrilled about, which all consultants put data into as part of pre-approval, but there's no ongoing survey. And we know, any ecologist knows, communities of fauna change over time, especially with things like climate change happening. Then there's funding of conservation as a way of spending some of that money rather than spending it on pre-approval surveys. We know what the big threats are to biodiversity, things like fire, feral species. Community attitude I see as a threat. That's where farmers who keep on clearing bits of land, where suburbs have no bush left because people are scared of bush, where politicians can get away with what they get away with because the voters don't vote the right way, like we all voted. And there's examples of some threatening processes. Fire, my favourite, and a cat with one night's meal. Cats have a very efficient digestive system. Nothing's left within 12 hours of when it gets eaten. So that's one night's meal, small lizards for a feral cat. So a few key points to sum up. Environmental impact assessment fraud investigations are expensive. They're often quite wasteful, to be honest. And the next step for them to help with nature conservation in a better way is to have them address the question on a case-by-case basis. And it's not that hard. It's easy to roll out a survey, but it's not that hard to actually think about the question as it applies to each project. It's also an opportunity for research. There's an example down there which is half obscured by a screen. There are pre-approval investigations to form a baseline for monitoring. And then there's a funding levy, not just offsets, but a funding levy for development where we know we're going to get development happening. I mean, look at where we are now. Energy intense concrete walls. Half of the people here drove. I came in on a train. Look at the steel on that train. We can't pretend these developments aren't going to happen, but we can try to make sure they pay for it better. And the image that's partly obscured is just a little example of the sort of information you can get by thinking about how you apply your sampling. It's a, it's not going to work, doesn't show very well. The little crosses are pitfall traps, and where we caught one species of lizard in a reserve. And is there any way of getting rid of that bit across the bottom?
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Oh, look,
I'll
perfect.
just put it up the top here.
Yeah. That's a small reserve. One of the people in the audience helped put the pitfall traps in. Small reserve in Wanneroo, where we caught one species of lizard. Vegetation is uniform. It's Banksia woodland and sand. There's something happening along that transect. And what it is time since fire. That the middle bit hadn't been burnt for 12 years. Two ends have been burnt 2 or 3 years ago. It seems obvious to hear, but the implications for the managers of that bit of land, local government, were huge. Oh, okay. Fire had an impact upon the biodiversity. We don't want to burn the middle bit because that's where all the animals are. They were getting pressured to burn the rest of the reserve, so it was no longer a fire hazard. So that's where, just a small example of where information collected by sampling can have positive benefits to management. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
That's my
Mike.
time.
That was really insightful. We have one question, please. Yes.
Yes, I'm incredibly excited. You said you were worried about fire. Thought it was one of your favourite topics. I organised Fire and Biodiversity Forum in Margaret River last June. 450 people came. They're very, very concerned. And some of the speakers were talking about microorganisms, macroorganisms, the fact that invertebrates, as you said, the others are just 5% is dreadful effect. Could you give me a comment like what you found there? How on earth this work, this rehabilitation, conservation, if it's burnt every few years? I mean, the latest science says 40 to 50 years, and the forest will be self-clearing and managing itself and way less flammable. So how on earth did we get this through? Please tell me.
We're just for those people listening online, we're just having a conversation about biodiversity and fire and how we can manage species over time when we're having so many fires. So Mark's just going to answer that question.
Mike's going to run screaming from the room. It's very hard. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a short answer. And the short answer is that there's an entrenched attitude towards fire in our society, which we're up against. The science is pretty much in on terms of fire. And scientists know that fires should be less frequent, more variable, different seasons. We've also lost all the mammal species that used to turn the soil over. We've changed the forest structure so it's now more flammable. You look at Jarrah Forest and it's all secondary regrowth with little poles everywhere. It should be 3 big trees per hectare or something and nothing in between. So we've made a flammable forest. And unless you go through and cut 9 out of 10 trees down and wait 200 years, it's going to take a long time to get that structure back. So there's all sorts of issues happening. I don't have an answer for you really, except that we need to keep the conversation going. That sounds a bit of a cop-out, I know. And we need to, I'm struggling, you can tell, I'm struggling to find the right words.
I'm just happy that you are worried and talking about
Lots of people, thank you. Lots of people are worried, lots of scientists are worried, and it's a matter of keeping on pushing the science ahead of the dogma, shall we say. Yeah. Another one?
I was just going to say, you're not allowed to do more public education because it's a bit of a public health matter as well. And the main problem is with, as you say, people entrenched attitudes, is that no one's really educating the community. And so it's very hard to get the conversation going when people straight away, you already hold a very fixed opinion. Particularly if they come from any farming communities.
Yeah, there's a great fear of fire. It's a very European thing. And it's justified because we build permanent homes and put them in stupid places, are allowed to, and then expect someone to protect them. So there's all sorts of problems with our relationship with fire in the landscape currently.
Thank you. Thank you.
Happy to chat about fire afterwards. It's a very difficult one.
Very difficult topic, probably needs a whole forum. So thanks very much, Mike. And now I'll also introduce Emeritus Professor Mike Calver, who will be speaking about the role of science and scientists in nature conservation. Mike is best described as a frustrated entomologist, having spent a career trying to return to his interest in insects, while his colleagues and students have sidetracked him into wildlife ecology. In his retirement, he's continued the key task of running the weekly happy hour at the Environmental and Life Sciences at Murdoch University, as well as doing much writing, as well as supervising students in animal ecology. And it's great to have you here tonight. Mike was actually one of my lecturers, and I've had the great privilege of working alongside the great man. So thank you, Mike.
Sorry. I don't know if anybody's noticed as well, these amazing artworks that are going on. We've just had a slide change, but we'll share them at the end. Here we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you everybody for coming out to hear some talks on a cold winter's evening. As Claire has explained, I'll be talking about the role of science and scientists in nature conservation. But first, I would like to also add my acknowledgement of country, and in particular to make a comment that the wisdom of the Indigenous people of Australia does need to be taken into account in all of our efforts at conservation. Okay, so to begin, I've divided my talk into two parts. And the first of those parts is to basically try and answer the question, why involve science and scientists? And the variety of reasons why we should do so. And one of the first is that it's important for us to be able to get evidence-based material to do with the numerous options that we often face in conservation situations. The second is that science at least allows us to acknowledge competing values and to see what evidence supports those values. And finally, science at least can warn us about delayed consequences, which is, well, if you do nothing about this now, nothing great's going to happen, but 15 or 20 years later, you'll wish that you'd done something. So those are the broad areas where science can get involved. Now, this morning, just before I was coming out here, and Steph very kindly whipped in this slide for me, my attention was drawn to a recent production, as in released yesterday, from the BBC and Cambridge University, and they basically looked at what's there on the left-hand side, the evidence effect, as they call it, the value of evidence in nature conservation. So that's a video. If you want to Google evidence effect, or there's a URL there for you if you want a copy of the presentation later. And on the right-hand side is the much more detailed website upon which the video is based. And from there, you can basically access all manner of evidence-based information in relation to conservation issues. So I thought I would put that one in. We haven't the opportunity to look at that video tonight, but those are clear, valuable resources to people who have an interest in those areas. You can see the phones out, people taking photographs of the screen. We can bring that back later if needed. But I want to focus by getting some cartoon figures in action to let us see exactly how the evidence situation works. So take a moment to read these two cartoons. So there we have the situation laid out for us. As we often face in conservation situations, we have competing options, competing explanations. What comes next? I really want you to zero in on now is the very last frame at the bottom right, in which Lucy, with her pet hypothesis destroyed, like all good scientists, responds by resorting to personal abuse. And that introduces the... Okay. Very good. Okay. But where we're going to now is critically, we've arrived at values and how they can actually influence what's going on. And these values that we all bring to any discussion can include, for example, outright bias values, which is like putting a thumb in the pan, not recording the data properly and so on, as we want to avoid. But the ones that are much harder to avoid are the methodological values. In other words, how we actually approach the problem, the rules that we set around the problem solving, and also the contextual values, which are basically those that are placed on us by a wider society, by our employers, and so on. So all of those values come into play as we assess the different options through evidence. And on this slide, I'd like you to start on the right. And what we're looking at on the right is a quote from the evolutionary biologist Dobzhansky, who reviewed a work by a creationist, major book by a creationist. And there he's basically telling us what we hope for from science, which is to have the evidence laid out for us so clearly that any thinking person could look at it and say, it's this and not that. But as he puts it in his final comment there, no weight of evidence will force people to accept what they find emotionally distasteful, what clashes with a core value. And if we look across then to the left-hand side, we see a consequence in the way in which we view conservation issues. So surely human-induced climate change is beyond doubt, but there are still plenty of doubters out there with big voices and deep pockets. So we still have these value issues coming through. Where I'd like to turn now is to a particular example, an area in which I'm working at the moment, in which we can actually show how the evidence and the values are coming together. And they're coming together also in a context in which we have that final element that I wanted to mention, the element of delayed consequences, because the consequences of some of our decisions in relation to the issue of stray cats might not hit us for quite a few years yet. But let's unpack the slide and see what's on it. Every city, big city around the world has a problem with stray cats. And we need to take action about this issue. And there are three principal reasons why we can't leave it and why we have to act. The first, of course, is for the welfare of the animals themselves. That horrible bloody picture up there at the top right as a result of road accident trauma for a cat. The cat to the right of that suffered an attack from a raptor. They have very dangerous, short and unpleasant lives. The second point is probably one that would occur to many of us from a conservation perspective. These animals have an impact on the wildlife. And so through predation and disease, and then finally at the bottom there, they also spread human pathogens. And so there's a public health issue involved here as well. So there's our context, and what might we do about it? Well, on this particular slide, I've outlined some of the major options for action in relation to the stray cat problem. One at the top is trap them, remove them, cull them, and at the same time, try and turn off the tap of people dumping unwanted animals. And if you manage that, you can see that you are addressing the animal welfare issue in the sense that they're no longer there to suffer, protecting the wildlife, and you're protecting public health. What is far more popular and common, though, in many places through the Western world is trap, neuter, and return. So catch a stray cat, snip, off come the bits, and you put it back. And if you cut their bits off, they don't get involved in fighting over mating and territory and these sorts of things. So you've got some small improvement in welfare. You hope that the population will reduce over a few years, but you're not protecting the wildlife and you're not addressing the public health issue. The third option is one that doesn't get a lot of airplay, the trap, assess and resolve. What's going on there is a process that a particular New Zealand organisation called the Lonely Meow has been championing, and that's you catch them, you socialise them and adopt them out wherever possible as an alternative to putting them back or putting them down. Now, when we come to look at these solutions, you probably gathered that my personal perspective is numbers 1 and 3, that realistically, in terms of solving the problems, they are the most desirable approaches. But there are many folk who are arguing for the middle one, and they're arguing off their ethical value that we owe cats because it's not their fault that they're there. They are companion animals in our society, and therefore we need to treat them right and that's the best way to do it. I don't have solutions to some of the complex and dilemmas, but I do show this as illustrative of the kinds of issues I've been discussing. What about the delayed consequences? We don't have rabies in Australia yet, but it's coming. And I think sooner or later, we will have to deal with rabies in this country. And when we do, I'd rather that we didn't do it from a basis of having lots of colonies of desexed stray cats sitting in the middle of our suburbs, just waiting to get ravaged by the rabies. Now to the second part of my talk, and here I wanted to explore obstacles to getting scientists involved, and in particular getting them involved to the right kinds of questions, the ones that many conservationists would like addressed and answered. And we've heard a few suggestions about some of those already this evening. And the major obstacles that are confronting us here are the reward structures in science. So what determines what scientists want to do? Suppression of science, and perhaps scientists and the rest of us in relation to these evidence-based approaches need to learn to disagree, and to disagree intelligently and productively. Let me unpack and begin with the reward structures. Anyone who's been involved in working in science will understand the importance of publication to scientists. It's how you build a career, it's how you're recognised by your peers, and one of the routes to scientific obscurity is not to publish. But what kinds of things are recognised as worthwhile publications? What I've got here, I apologise for the length of the quote, but I do need it to make the point. It's a quote from Gary Meff, who at the time, 2006, was the editor-in-chief of Conservation Biology, arguably the premier journal in the conservation biology field. And Meff was basically saying, well, what do you need to do to get published in conservation biology? And you can see the criteria there. You need solid science, but you also need to be novel. You also need to transcend species and location. You need to appeal to a broad international audience, and you need to advance the discipline broadly, not just focusing on a particular locality or a particular species. That's what you need to do to build a career. But if you're wanting people to collect information on a particular species in a regional location for local return and benefit, this is not the way you will build the career under the scientific reward structure. And indeed, my colleagues and I actually had a look at species recovery plans. This is focusing in on Australia. We looked at some other countries as well, but it's in Australia, looking at 50 randomly chosen species recovery plans and looking at the literature cited in those plans. Then, if you start at the top where it says A+ journals, and you start to work your way clockwise around the figure, the A+ are the ones that would be most highly regarded in terms of scientific standing, kudos, the ones where you want to publish. And then you work your way around through lesser valued resources. And my point is quite clear. The highly valued resources in the scientific reward system are not necessarily the ones that the people who are involved at the ground level need and want, where they source their information from many different places. I now want to turn to scientific suppression. Recent work published in Australia has identified that suppression is alive and well, and as you can see from the figures, practiced by government, industry, and universities. And that suppression extends to internal communications within organisations, to media releases, to the publications in the scientific literature, and to presentations, such as the one we're hearing this evening. So there is potential for suppression. We don't want certain data and opinions to be out there. This is a significant issue, and certainly in the modern social media world, it extends brutally to humiliation and threat of people who express unwanted views. Here I have what happened to a particular author, Bruce Gilley, who published a paper called The Case for Colonialism. The paper's been pulled. Why? The publisher pulled it because the editor of the journal and the editorial team received death threats. So this is pretty extreme, but it's where it can go beyond the government type suppression through to wider social vilification. And now to my final point. It's perfectly possible for people to disagree on issues of science and the interpretation of evidence. So this is a framework from Jamie Kirkpatrick from the University of Tasmania about what we might do in such situations. Declare your interests. Basically, if you're taking money to express an opinion, say so. Keep away from personal attacks. Outline where the proponents agree, because disagreements are most easily understood and interpreted from a context of fundamental agreement. Where are you springing off from? And then when it comes to your disagreements, you lay them out and conclude by stating what empirical data would cause you to change your mind. That's where the rabbit comes in. It's from a famous quote by Haldane, the evolutionary biologist, who was asked what evidence would lead him to discount evolution, and he apparently retorted, rabbit fossils in the Precambrian. But if you are arguing scientifically, you ought to be able to express that. What data, what evidence would lead you to change your opinion? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Does anybody have a question? You've blown them away. It was a very insightful topic. Thank you very much. Now we're going to cross to our panel. Not sure how the panel is going to work on the Zoom. Okay. So while we're sorting that out, I'd just like to invite our three panelists up to the stage, Dr. Nick Dunlop, Dr. Mike Bamford, and Mike Calver. Dr. Mike Calver. Thanks very much for coming. So unfortunately we're short on microphones, but if people can ask the question and then I'll try and repeat it, and then one of the panelists can answer the question. So yes, sir.
So, how much is population increase in the southwest an issue in keeping land for nature?
So the question was, how much is population increase in the southwest a problem for nature conservation? And do you have a particular panelist that you'd like to ask, or just general?
Nick seemed to talk about the southwest.
Well, it's very obvious that the larger the population and the more wealthy they are, the bigger the impact they have on the environment. But it isn't actually a nice neat one-to-one relationship. There's a whole lot of other factors about people's values and use of the environment, which also may impinge on their ultimate outcome. But I think it's very important in the face of growing population that we make provision for nature ahead of the pressures that are coming, rather than just become reactionary with each new project, change in land use that will occur.
I guess I could add that it's fairly well known that Australians have a very large footprint because of the way we live, the homes we choose to live in and so on. I was talking to someone about Singapore just a couple of days ago, where they've got virtually Australia's population, I believe, on a smaller island, and people have quite different lifestyles. So Singapore has amazing biodiversity. So it's just a matter of how you distribute that population. But population growth is still the elephant in the room in any environmental question.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have a question? Yeah, I'll just get you.
Can I address Nick Calver? You mentioned that we had these mammals in the forests that did this eating and burrowing and hiding up, putting all the huge vegetation. Has this really been seriously tried? Are these mammals still alive, still in existence? But has there been big efforts to try and do this, or has there been huge enclosed fences and vast areas of forest not? Has there been an attempt to do that?
Actually, Michael Bamford.
That was me, yeah. That's okay. Most of the mammals are still with us. We're talking about things like woylies, foodies, quokkas, which is still in the forest in small numbers. Even wildebeest in the woodland areas are still with us, but not in those areas. And of course, most people will be aware of the exclusion pets and programs where these mammals do exceptionally well once they're fair predators. There's not much research in actual impact on nutrient cycling and soil structure and ability going on in those areas at present. It's certainly an area to look at. There are proposals for that predator exclusion approach in some of the forest areas, and we fascinated to see what happens. But it's part of, it's not just the loss of those mammals, it's a whole change in forest structure that's changed fire behaviour. And other things going on. I was talking again to an entomologist, about a number of moths whose larvae live in leaf litter of long unburnt forests and break the leaf litter down. There's this ridiculous assumption that if you talk about 10-year-old fuels versus 50-year-old fuels, it must be 5 times as much fuel, but we know that's not true. And one of the reasons it's not true is all these things that break down litter. So there's a lot going on, and the mammals that we're talking about have a role to play. We just don't understand it very well because we wiped it out so fast. The foxes did.
And the cats.
And the cats. Right.
Thank you, Mike. I'd just like to add a couple of quick comments in relation to the question. The first is to understand the context in which these animals are now operating. In a seminal paper published in 1965, the then Director of the Forests Department made the comment that by around 1920, an area of the Jarrah forest had then been cut over, and added that the forest canopy had been reduced by nearly 50%. Now, anyone who's been a gardener knows exactly what happens when you open up the shade and let the sun through. You get massive understory growth. That's one of the really major structural changes that is taking place. In relation to what our friendly little piggy mammals do, some of the studies that have looked at them have explained that they turn over the soil. In doing so, they reduce soil water repellency, a very, very common problem throughout the southwest of Western Australia. They spread propagules of plants, mycorrhizal fungi, other organisms, and they often deposit these propagules together with a nice nitrogen-rich cropping to encourage these things on the way. A little depression where the water collects. So very, very important. Still there, as Mike explained, but they're operating in a very challenging system.
Thank you very much.
Given our talk tonight about what can we do going forward, I just wanted to raise something which you guys might be aware of. But in the last couple of years, I've dealt with several mining companies, and I've questioned them, why are you destroying this bushland when there's a very big farm next door and it's completely trashed and you're not getting high productivity and stuff like that. And they said to me, it will cost an awful lot more for us to get that land than to destroy the Western land, say Southern Cross or whatever. And it's very upsetting. I sort of, it's something that seems like you could do something about if you could convince the government to have acquisition measures that
necessarily award the people, reward the people a bit more than what they get for selling their land to another farmer. But if it was not forced on them, but if we could make it part of legislation so that that land can be swapped, and I'm not talking about the mining of the gold, say gold in the ground, but actually with the waste dumps infrastructure, it can easily go into the farms, and it's just so disturbing when you hear this from the mining companies and you think this is wrong. So I just put it to you, is there any way you can do anything about that?
Thank you. Fantastic question. Any more takers?
One of the problems with mining is the ore body is where the ore body is. Sometimes underground alternatives are better than open cut. A lot of these problems start with the Mining Act because companies register tenements, and then there are rules about what you can do on the different tenements. So often it's not particularly flexible about finding another way. And often, of course, we find out about it anyway. It's far too late for that to even be reasonably possible.
I found out about it directly by the clearing things, or when I was doing forestry surveys on the farm, on the tenement, and yeah, that can, it's not the gold, the gold and the fine. It's weird. They want to put all the other stuff, and I know they can't.
Yeah, but you obviously come across the same situation as we have. It's basically easier to get approval to clear bush than it is to buy a farmer's paddock. It's that private ownership thing which our society values so much that it's political suicide, if you like, for a politician to push to support a mining company to be able to buy up farmland, build their waste stockpile, when it's so easy just to clear a bit more bush.
And the Mining Act doesn't operate on private land.
We haven't helped.
No, it's okay.
Might need to be a political issue there that you push.
Who have we got?
Louise.
Hi, my question is actually to Mike Calver. So as an organisation, we want to put forward science-based approaches, and we want people to kind of understand how we've taken those approaches. You often get quite contentious issues that come up, and so it can be quite hard for organisations to kind of sift through. So in terms of having scientists take a broader role, how do you think they could maybe approach that so that we can get information that's better disseminated, so that organisations can actually act on it, rather than get caught up in the mire of the disagreements?
Thank you. Thanks, Louise.
There are probably quite a few different ways in which we can get scientific message more strongly out there. One way might be to have a website or some other publication supported by CCWA, in which basically you've got people who are scanning the literature, noting relevant publications as they arise, and then actually approaching people and inviting them to prepare a succinct summary for the webpage of the work that they've done and its implications. So that's one way of trying to get something tight, succinct, and ready that you can use with the general public. In terms of the activists, those who actually like to take the scientific information and go out and do something with it, something like that would help us to ensure that we have the ideal of the informed activist. And in terms of the classification of these things, you have the informed activist, who's the ideal. Then you have the uninformed or ill-informed activist, which can be unfortunate. You have the delightfully named activist, who are the ones who don't really care what the arguments are one way or the other, but they know what they want. They're going out to get it. And then, of course, hopefully you will motivate some of the activists That's a really good idea. And what time's the footy game on? So that's one suggestion. In terms of others, you can try and have seminar series and inviting people to come and talk, as you're doing tonight. It's another way of getting things out there. Perhaps in the larger scheme of things, particularly where we're waiting on data to come in, and questions are still open. I really like Kirkpatrick's approach to dealing with the disputes, which is basically declare your interests, don't get personal, acknowledge where everybody agrees, then put your disagreements, and be prepared to say what would cause you to change your mind. I heard a chap called Steve Morton giving a talk at one conference in which he was speaking about extinctions in the Australian arid zone, and he made the comment, those of you who've been following my work will be aware that I've changed my mind. It doesn't hurt me to say that I've changed my mind. What did upset me was when I told my colleagues and students, and they said, not to worry, Steve, we never believed you.
Thank you.
This is addressed to the panel, and we can all think about it. The environmental legislation in relation to PER approvals processes are the final step in all of this is that the minister has the power of veto. You know, I know of an instance locally where 471 people, the public, wrote and objected. There were, I can't remember the numbers, but 20 or 30 actually physically attended a Shire meeting and objected and represented the objection. And the EPA scientists produced a paper refusing to allow this project to continue or to proceed. And finally, at the end of it, in spite of all that, all these scientists with letters after their name, the minister, who had no letters after his name, signed up and said, you know, we can mitigate these problems. And he wrote, he ended up passing back to the EPA the job of compliance by the proponent. And, you know, it was just a joke. And I believe that a new iteration of the environmental process still includes the minister's veto. I think that ministers are bloody idiots, and they should involve scientific or some other method. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm sure you've got something to say about this.
Yeah, every act of parliament begins with, in the beginning, God created the minister. And you don't really need to know any more than that. Obviously, the advantage of the EPA process is at least the advice to the minister is given in public, and that is where pressure can be applied to the minister's electoral survival. If he doesn't take that advice, then there may be electoral consequences on offer, unfortunately, but the reality is at least we know what the minister was told, so the minister can be held accountable. But we need to get better at that. But at the end of the day, no, it really doesn't matter everything that happens before. In the beginning, God created the minister.
I couldn't put it better myself.
Like Calver.
Yeah, good comments there, Nick. Two thoughts in relation to this. The first one would be is that we have been handed a gift. And the gift that we have been handed is the way in which governments have attempted to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they have tried to make a high-profile issue of listening to the science. Whether one believes that they've done this or whether some issues get swept under the carpet is another matter. But at least the rhetoric has been to listen to the science. So we actually have a yardstick now to pin them to. When you thought there was a real emergency and the consequences were immediate, you wanted to listen to the science. We would like you to listen to the science, and it might not be a current emergency, and when the consequences may be extensively delayed, but we want you to listen to the science. That would be one point. The other point, and that's something that occurred to me in relation to Nick's comment about the revisions coming forward, commenting on the 2016 Biodiversity Act. What about a group of scientists amongst us actually getting together and putting an opinion piece into Pacific conservation biology? Basically, we're due for a revision of the 2016 State Act. This is our wish list from the scientific community of what the new version of the Act should look like. I've actually got a chance to preempt it and to write something. And the editor's sitting here, I'm thinking, I would be very interested to receive such a paper, and I would certainly put it out for public review before publication. So there's some thoughts and responses to the question.
Thank you very much, and great insights there.
Concerning the clearing regulations, how do we get the government to actually implement the clearing regulations in the spirit and intent in which they're written? They say that native vegetation should not be cleared if it's at variance to one of the 10 clearing principles. So over cleared areas as declared red flora, and so forth. But they've been for years just allowing clearing that should have been prevented. It's a real failure in implementation of the regulations. How do we get that addressed?
Thank you, Mary. Who would like to take this question?
The biggest mistake we made, and we partly made it, was to shift regulation of clearing from an environmental assessment process under Part 4 of the Act and make it a regulation for Part 5, where the expectation is not that you won't be allowed to clear, you just have to get a licence, which is, you're not allowed to pollute unless you get a licence. It's basically managed in that way. At least when we had an assessment process, there was a much more transparent opportunity for people to evaluate what the costs and benefits were of a particular action. Of course, that takes a lot more resources and time to do a proper assessment, but we've basically got it in a space now where it's you just apply, you get a license, and that's it. There's no real constraint there. And as far as governments not following their own rules, well, we've seen that everywhere. We've taken them to court on numerous occasions for not following their own policies and rules, and not being successful in dealing with it. And the solution to that is probably going to be a political solution.
Has there ever been a court case under the clearing regulation? Not that I'm aware of.
I was just going to add both the clearing principles and under the EPBC Act there's a set of principles as well, and they're really badly worded. You've really got to be causing animals go extinct or near extinct to actually say, yes, this is going to happen, therefore you can't proceed. The wording is quite unfortunate in those principles. So it makes it very hard to put a case to stop clearing in many cases.
Might be a bit cynical perhaps, and I'm quoting a colleague here from many years ago, but he basically described these sorts of conditions as being about as precautionary as morning after Greenwell. And there we are, this is a making point for someone who's put it up.
we live up in the hills and we have quite an issue with a land developer having such clout that when we've actually been trying to deal with a very delicate, biodiverse environment where it's got a catastrophic fire risk, that he has been able to completely bully his way through, and he's had a secret tribunal, so the community is not privy to what is going on. And this is supposed to be democracy, and we've got, you know, he's trying to put a high density development up there, which is absolutely horrific, that he should be allowed to get away with it in this day and age, if it is a democracy.
You have anything to say, Mike?
I'm trying to think of something you haven't said. I mean, it's a situation which you do see all too often, decisions being made sort of behind the counter in these sort of situations. It's incredibly frustrating. And it does come back into legislation and leaving principles. It's just so hard for the legislation that we have to be used to stop a project. It's very unusual for a project to stop because the consequences have to be so disastrous to biodiversity to trigger the legislation.
We had all that in place though. So, you know, the Shire and the voluntary fire brigade and everybody have actually said this mustn't go ahead. And yes, and the commission, they also said it mustn't go ahead. But because he's got such clout and he has these big functions where he can go and give the Labour Party $1,500 a head ticket for these big things. It's all money and it's criminal.
For those who are listening online, there was further information just given about the clout that the developer actually has and about our advice from a number of important authorities is being ruled. I would be very interested in this kind of context to see how the current federal parliament unfolds, where we now have significant numbers of members who are not beholden to major parties, who are able to ask important questions and who are able to fire up over issues in a way that Jack Bailey, for example, has done in the term of the last parliament. So it's not a short-term fix, it's a longer-term fix. But I think it's about time that we started thinking of flexing collective political muscle and actually getting people elected to Parliament and actually perfecting the letter writing to MPs, and also taking advantage of social media and the like to be able to publicise the letters we are writing and the replies we receive. So to start shining lights into how these things are discussed and how these questions are resolved, because making things public is often a very effective way of getting someone to sit up and take notice.
One of the things we tend to do with all these things is that we lose a battle and we move on. You should not move on. You should always make sure that you're there to witness and document the consequences, because it's by doing that that you change attitudes. And too often something's happened, someone's got approval, and we don't go back and find out whether the project was actually delivered according to its conditions. We don't go back and measure what the environmental consequences actually were, rather than the ones that were projected or forecast. So I think we tend to leave the battlefield too early, and that actually leaves a bit of a problem next time something comes around.
Thank you. Mike Calver, regarding the humiliation and threat, the scientists who would like to publish unwanted findings, I know there's a problem with universities and funding and if it's linked to industry or whatever, but what about journal editors? When they call in reviewers, is there a problem that a person who's rocking the boat and wanting to move on to new findings is then hit with a deeply knees dug in type reviewer, linked, even if they're retired now, linked to the industry which is being challenged? So what could journal editors do to make that peer review process more fair?
Thanks very much. A great question.
Thank you. The question has, I think, basically set public for another follow talk. I should try and be as succinct as possible. So first up, way back last century, the editors then of the Marine Pollution Policy Journal published a wonderful editorial called "Good Scientists Must Have Good Manners." And the thrust of the editorial was that they were fed up with peer reviewers who resorted to personal abuse, threats, goodness knows what else, to shut up opinions. And essentially, if somebody is wrong, you say so, explain why they're wrong, and there can be a decision to reject. But if you just don't like the findings and you want to say in fairly vituperative terms that you don't, go back in your corner. It's not something to be considered. And it's certainly good advice, I think, to editors at any time. Entrenched interests respond in that way. Having said that, it is also incredibly important to remember that reviewers do not accept or reject manuscripts. Editors do. And editors are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the decisions. So I take the view that the editor consults reviewers for advice on a manuscript, looks at the manuscript, looks at the advice given, and comes to a judgment. And that judgment may not necessarily be to accept the recommendation for rejection, and in fact possibly to publish in the face of a recommendation for rejection. So here are some examples that could happen. Give me some scenarios, very real ones that are played out in editorial boards around the world. Controversial manuscript. Now that I know so-and-so have convictions about this. I will ask so-and-so. I know that this person will not like this and will object to it, but I will get the strongest possible criticism of the manuscript. I want to look at the substance of that criticism. And if there's something in there that convinces me there is something gravely wrong in what has been said, then you lead to a decision to reject. But if it's an emotive type argument without a lot of substance, or if it's you interpret the data this way, I think the data means this, without a convincing reason why it should be different, now there's no reason to block someone, but you draw the strongest objections out during the peer review process for the author to have an opportunity to deal with them in revising the manuscript, to basically put in, one might advance the argument such and such, I disagree with that argument for these reasons, and build the manuscript up and make it stronger as a consequence of that. You can wind up in situations where a reviewer and an author simply will not see eye to eye with a differing opinion, where there is no good reason on the basis of the data to favour one or the other. In those circumstances, I personally would lean to publication, but what I would say to the author is, see what the reviewer thinks. The reviewer's entitled to an opinion, and so are you. There is no clear right or wrong here. But I will go ahead and publish, but please understand that I will invite the reviewer, if the reviewer wishes, to publish a commentary on your paper, to to which you will have right of reply. So all the arguments, all the discussion on this issue, which is not black and white, will be there on the record for people to see. So those are the sorts of things that editors can do. There are many complexities that sit across these things, nuances of different issues. Probably the principle that's always worth everybody remembering is the editor makes the decision and the reviewer advises. And we quite often get comments from reviewers that I rejected the paper. Why hasn't it been rejected? Because that was your recommendation. I make a decision, and then I wear the consequences of that decision.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Hi, I have two sort of partial questions. One is about what happens to the petitions which come into the government to a minister, for example, in the DBCA area. You know, you're saying that, for example, we need to publicise more the rejections that our letters and petitions are receiving, which is now happening quite a bit on Facebook, thanks to various groups of people with concerns getting together. You know, do you actually ever see these, or do these come to the administrative people, you know, well down the, you know, for example, I know there was one that came from the Denmark Environment Centre last year, about 1,600 petitions from people concerned about prescribed burns and the effect on biodiversity. And that was presented by, I think, perhaps Brad Petit, maybe presented it to Parliament. Where does it go after that? And the other one is about A-class reserves and they're being excised by the government. So, for example, in the last couple of years, at least 3 you know, parts of A-class reserves, Tuari, Allen Park and Swanbourne and Morris and Swanbourne, I think, have been excised by the current government. I mean, that A-class reserves the same status as Kings Park. Do you get any say in that, or is that something that is just you know, we don't seem to be winning here, because even our A-class reserves can just be excised to some commercial development with government and ground fancies.
Has to be approved by Parliament.
Right. So how are they achieving that so easily?
Do you want to take that one?
That's really that process, isn't it?
Well, just on reserve status, yes, in the beginning, God created the minister, and if he wants to excise parts of a nature reserve or national park, they can do that. But in the case of an A-class reserve, it has to get through both houses of Parliament, whereas a C-class reserve can just be published in the government gazette, and that's it. So, you know, once again, you have to make sure that there's transparency going on here, people can see what's going on, and you know, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance, basically. But you know, ministers of the Crown can do these things.
Perhaps this is another example where good use of the web may actually help. So there simply exists a web page, maintaining, which basically is petitions on environmental matters to state Parliament. Date petition, what was requested in the petition, decision of Parliament, comment on the consequences. They're just making it available so that people can see, so people can be referred to it. There is clear evidence. And one of the things that tends to at least give people pay more attention is actually to have it publicised. Because if it's up and available like that, and you build a record over time, it's really hard to step away from. And eventually you begin to build up the pressure. So it's just try and make sure that people are aware of what was asked, what was decided, And at the end of the day, the implied threat is always there. We vote.
I think the Post newspaper does a great job of publicising values. That's called the permanent record of many of these other issues. A lot of people nowadays just don't do their social media, and it's not possible to communicate with everybody through their web pages. It's a good idea.
Thank you. Anyone?
Just to follow up to your situation in particular and others, one of the things we don't have here in WA is a court of appeal based on merits. And Dr. John Bailey years ago recommended this. He was a former deputy chair of the EPA and environmental law lecturer at Murdoch. But we're really lacking. Other states have that sort of thing. So these issues could be decided by a court based on the merits of the situation.
Anything to say on this?
And it's something that's been suggested a few times that operates in New South Wales. And it's actually an alternative model to an EPA, really, because it's not subject to the same political influences that the process is. There's no interest in government to have such structures in WA. And there's also the complex issue of once you start trying to defend something in any kind of court, it comes with a large bill attached, which is something that we can't often deal with.
I'm just going to take one last question now from Sue, because we are getting on into the evening.
Sorry, Sue from the Urban Bushland Council. This is for anybody. Surveys, I agree with you, Mike. We can't contest them when they come up, and it appears that whatever the ecologist finds in those surveys, that's it. We have bush care groups who've done surveys, who are experts. They know what is in their patch, but it doesn't count. Not just heard a talk on about iNaturalists, and the same applies to eBird. We're finding new species, we're finding threatened species in places where they haven't been recorded before. We've got photos with GPS points that have been identified, but we can't use them yet. So many new species have been identified with citizen science using iNaturalists. And there's a lot of research coming out of iNaturalists with that information. How can we use it to try and stop some of these clearings that are going on?
Obviously, there's good information that's come in subsequent to a survey being done by a consultant, then the consultant should be able to use that information, or at least it should be available to the regulators making decisions, as long as it's, especially if you've got photographs. I know that iNaturalist is very good at providing photographs and identifications, and to be honest, some of the consultants aren't very good at identifying things themselves. But I guess the point I was making is that there is a very strong emphasis on survey results and not looking at ecosystem function, for example, especially in small fragmented landscapes where it doesn't really matter what is in there. It's the ecosystem function is happening because that bit of bush is left and it's connected or not connected next door. There's too little appreciation for that ecological level of assessment, even though that's part of the objective of the EPA, different by italicized objective. It's very frustrating, the heavy weight put on the short-term results of a quick survey.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I'll just speak to your point about the citizen science. We can't understate the value of citizen scientists. We've got people out there with vast expanses of knowledge, and we can put it to use in many ways. You know, when you're talking about iNaturalists, there's one example that comes to mind of the iSeahorse project. It's run through iNaturalist. About 25%, I think, of observations are outside known distributions of seahorse. So we're learning completely new information about these populations. And secondly, the information that has been collected as part of that project was used in the Philippines to create a new marine park. So, you know, it really speaks volumes about what we can actually use as data for. And the Fairy Turn Network is another fantastic example. So, you know, as individuals, we can do a lot. We probably need to come together a lot more and think about the ways that we can start addressing these issues. We've all heard some fantastic potential ways that we can address these problems. Mike's comment about having an opinion piece and how we might be able to influence the Biodiversity Conservation Act. Mike had some great comments about what we can maybe do, or the EPA could do to try and improve some of their practices. And, you know, Nick's suggestion of having a nature, you know, putting parcels of land away for species conservation and nature conservation. So, yeah, fantastic insights. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. Please stay with us for some refreshments, and the speakers will be around if you have a dying question that you haven't been able to answer. But yeah, thanks. Please put your hands together for a fantastic. I'd just like to lastly thank the girls at the Citizen Science, at the Conservation Council for putting this evening together, and to Nick for actually suggesting this wonderful topic. Thanks very much.